Thank you, Helen. And moving on, if we may, now on to something else that I know you've been a big fan of for a long time. Interestingly, from what you said earlier about not liking repertory grids, however, I know you're a big fan of the resistance to change grid. I wonder if you could just tell me a little bit about what a resistance to change grid is and then how you use them.
Yes. I think a resistance to change grid is very useful because you don't need to send it away for any kind of statistical analysis.
That's always a
bonus.
bonus.
The important thing about it is that the result's self-evident. When you finish doing it, it either makes sense to the person you're working with or it doesn't. And if it's wrong, they'll tell you.
Okay.
So that's really good about it. It's sort of an instant response.
Which is always nice when you're using it in some form of counselling or coaching sessions.
That's right.
So how does it work then?
Well, it works by, first of all, you have to decide what sort of elements you want to put. I think maybe as an example, I'll talk about what I did in Yorkshire later on after I'd moved up to York. I did actually get a job, which was fantastic, in the health service, working for Yorkshire Regional Health Authority. And it was a most fortunate time because they believed in development and training, and I had some expertise from my experience in London in doing some market research to have a look at what people would want and so on. And I also won a contract which gave us some money to take doctors to Ashridge Management Training College.
Right, yeah.
Now, I wasn't happy that we just had a contract to take doctors away from the health service. I said I would put this in the middle of a development programme for managers and doctors and for them to be working together over this period of time.
Which will have been quite a radical
thought. It was
thought,
at the time because doctors had only just started being involved in general management at all and were very resistant to being any more involved in it.
Yeah.
So what I did was to interview about 150 people who might be taking part in these programmes, and using resistance to change grids, I got them to explore elements to do with development and training, which might emerge from this experience of going to Ashridge and the programme that we were going to design around it.
Can you remember what some of the elements were then?
Well, there were things like what sort of outcomes they might want from this, like being better able to run their departments, or quite straightforward things, which I had actually tested out with a group of people that I met with to say what sort of elements do you think would be useful. And they were basically quite concrete things to do with improved skills in team development, that sort of thing. And we used those in order to identify personal constructs, similarities and differences between these elements. And we got to the point of having a lot of personal constructs, which we then laddered. Now, laddering technique, do you want me just to briefly say that? When you get people to identify what's important for them, for example, maybe harmonious as opposed to upsetting, you'd say, well, if you had to choose between things being harmonious or upsetting, which would be your preferred position? And probably they'd say harmonious, or that's what I'm saying anyway at the moment. And you would then ask them, what is it about things being harmonious that's important to you? And they might say, because things work more smoothly, as opposed to things being really difficult and upsetting. And then you'd gradually find out which is the most important thing of that. And you'd identify from all these concrete elements more abstract ideas that were important to them. And then you would ask them, if you were to wake up tomorrow morning on a desert island and all you knew about yourself was that, let's say, harmonious and difficult was one of them, and all you knew about yourself was that you could remain harmonious, but you'd have to accept things being uneven, which might be the non-preferred position on the other side of another construct. Which would it be easier for you to accept? Things being difficult or uneven? And they might say, well, uneven. So you would go through all these constructs, 9 or 10 of them, and you would find out which position the person preferred and which they were more open to change on. It's a little bit difficult to describe it.
Yeah.
It's better if you see it.
If I understand you, you're saying that you'd have 9 or 10 constructs and then you compare each one against every other one.
That's right, until you found out whether the number one was the most important or the least important, and gradually the others. And when you lay the cards out in front of a person, they can see at a glance if it makes sense, and they'll say, that's right, that really is fundamental to me.
So it gives effectively, I suppose, a hierarchy of importance.
That's right, that's right. So you know, in terms of designing programmes of development and so on, where it would be quite easy to introduce ideas because they're not going to be too resistant, and where you have to be very, very careful not to disrespect the things that really matter to the people who are coming on these programmes.
Okay, thank you. So how did you use that with the managers then, and what sort
Well, the same
of results?
thing. I did the same thing with the managers in terms of the whole development programme that we were planning to have, where managers and doctors were working together. We called it Doctors and Managers Working Together, simple title.
Which, again, going back in those days, will have been...
It was unusual in those days, yes.
So how did that whole exercise work and pan out?
Well, it worked out interestingly, because I did the resistance to change grid particularly then, because I thought it looked rather formal and scientific, and that people are not going to just say when you go through the door, and I'd like to talk to you about this programme that you're going to be going on and about what interests you and so on, that they would take it seriously, because there was the numerical side of it.
Yes.
So doing the resistance to change grid was fine, and they would come up with what was most important and what was less important, what they were more open to change about. And then I wanted very much this programme to be about personal development. So I used another approach called a core process interview, which was biographical.
Right.
And I didn't do it first, because I thought if you started off asking people to tell you stories about themselves, they would be very resistant and they might not want to do it.
Interesting.
But I used it as a contrast to the resistance to change grid. And this was about asking them to think about their lives, cutting it up into 4 chunks, which, they thought was appropriate from birth until their current age.
Yeah.
And then asking them to tell me about 2 incidents in each of these chunks when they felt really, really good about themselves, when they felt really fulfilled and everything in the world was happy for them. And to tell me the story a little bit about what was going on for them at the time, who was around, what sort of things were happening, imaginary. And in those days, I just wrote very, very, very fast and wrote down this story. And we had 8 stories at the end of that interview. And then I asked them to look at what I'd written down and to highlight themes and patterns that seemed to be interesting and important to them.
It sounds also almost a little bit that you're getting a variation of the self-characterisation grid, because you must be able to find certain constructs, as you say, the themes and what's important.
Self-characterising didn't seem to be appropriate in that particular instance, because I just wanted the storytelling part just to be happy memories, and it wasn't about being objective about themselves. It was just telling personal stories, and I wanted that biographical part to be important. And the very interesting thing about that was most people really enjoyed doing it, and surprise, surprise, they found that similar things were important to them from the core process interview as had emerged from the resistance to change, which had taken 3 times as long to do and was much more formal, but the results were remarkably similar.
Which is always nice, both for you as the consultant, but for them as well, that it validates both techniques.
And also they went away feeling pretty positive about themselves, because they'd been talking about good things and what mattered.
And so it was only the good things you were looking for as part of
it was in the
4
core process interview, yes. And then, because you can imagine there were hundreds and hundreds of constructs that emerged from this exercise, I got all the people together, in large groups of 40 or 50 at a time, and we put all these constructs mixed up from the resistance to change and the core process interviews, and got them to put them into categories that could show them something about what was going on for all of them, so they all had each other's constructs to
so
kind of
almost
play
like
with.
a Q sort?
I suppose so. Yes, yes. But it was part of the programme as a preliminary to get them to sort of know the language that all the others had been using and to see if there were some similarities and differences.
It sounds like, or I know the way I do something similar is with post-it notes on flip charts.
That's the same sort of thing.
Get them to give a title or an overarching construct for their flip chart.
They could agree enough on, because it gets, whatever you do takes you away from the personal nature of it.
It does.
But it does help you to actually look at the group and get some sense of what's going on in the group. And they're doing it, not you. You're not imposing it.
Fascinating. So how did that whole change programme work?
It was the beginning of about 10 years of programmes, really. And it became extremely popular because it was very, very interesting that people really, really loved the programmes that we designed around this information. And it involved doctors and managers coming together in groups of about 20 or 21 at a time, within which there'd be 3 groups of 7 for action learning sets, so that they worked as a small group within the programme, looking at issues facing them in their work. And we developed programmes of personal development around that, and they became very popular because doctors and managers actually started to become very good friends, because you can't work like that over a period of time.
But sharing some quite sensitive and
Absolutely.
Emotionally laden.
And building up a lot of trust between them.
And they say personal construct psychology has no emotional content.
I don't know who says that. I think it is a form of motion, and that is emotion. I think it's fundamentally a form of motion, which is emotion.
And I would agree totally with that one. So, well, that's a lovely example of where you've used the resistance to change and the core process interview within a larger framework.
Yes.
What other uses are there for the resistance to change and the core process interview?
Well, again, in therapy and working with clients, working with them individually, it's a really, really helpful diagnostic tool. When you're working with people, you don't know their stories, and Kelly doesn't present very many tools and techniques, but he does say diagnosis is really, really important, and you can't guess at what's going on for people without finding ways of getting them to talk about it.
Definitely.
And I think both those methods are really, really useful. Don't use them all the time, but they are very, very useful in terms of getting to know where a person's coming from. I mean, in one-to-one work, I wouldn't use elements like, working in a team and that sort of thing. I'd be asking people about characters in their lives and using those as elements so that it's much more personal what emerges from that work.
Well, the team bit and the first way you used it seems to reflect really Kelly's sociality corollary.
Yes, and then getting people to be exposed to all these constructs from everybody else, get a sense of, is there any commonality in this group or not, and how we can as a group work together to see what's emerging that we can agree on and differ on.
Definitely. And I would assume by the way you've described it that part of the byproduct of having them sharing each other's constructs and then sorting them, it's almost going to involve a loosening of their own constructs.
Absolutely, yes.
Do you want to just talk a little bit more about that area?
Well, I think that the whole thing is a loosening. It's both a tightening and a loosening exercise, that you have actually to come up with some sort of commonality, but you're also free to see and discuss the fact that there are many differences between you.
Yeah.
So it's a good starting place. But I think people develop that sort of sociality when they get to know each other better in different circumstances, and when they're doing exercises which test them in unusual ways and so on. And we were very, very lucky that there was funding at the time to let people take part in a programme which spanned a whole year.
Definitely.
And that makes a huge difference.
Very
you didn't
much
have
so.
to do something in 2 days or 3 and cram it all in at once.
It allows you to get quality, doesn't it, as well as the quantity. And could you just go into a bit more detail about how you did it then and what you did?
Following all that research? Yes, well, I sort of organised a number of programmes involving doctors and managers, different backgrounds and so on, over a period of 5 or 6 years. And all the programmes involved both doctors and managers, and they were all spread over a period of about a year, with people working together in what we called action learning sets during that time on issues facing them at work, so that the programmes had some relevance when they went back to work.
Which is always important for me.
But also involving a lot of personal development through the programme, and involving them, surprise, surprise, to an introduction to personal construct psychology during the programme.
Good.
And various other things of that kind, and some outdoor exercises and things involving them in personal development. And they all had their own personal notebooks through these programmes, so they all wrote their own stories.
Self-reflective
the
diaries.
idea of Kelly's of, you write your own biography.
Excellent. So if I wanted to research it, find more information about it, is there anything available?
Yes, well, I did write it up in a book which is, I think, on the camera now, called A Textbook of Management for Doctors, by Tony White, who was actually a doctor involved in some of these programmes nationally at the time. And I wrote a chapter describing this research in some detail, and it's on page 47, I think. And I think the publishers were Churchill Livingstone.
Excellent. Oh, that should be fascinating. Thank you very much, Helen. Thank you.